Recorded COVID-19 cases worldwide have surpassed the 290 million, with a total of 5.44 million deaths. The Omicron variant now threatens to fuel a new surge as the U.S. reports all-time high infections, and Europe has tallied more than 100 million COVID cases since the start of the pandemic. The Omicron-led surge in the U.S. has sent children to hospitals in close to record numbers, and the U.S. Defense Secretary recently even calmed down with COVID. So what makes Omicron so transmissible? How much verified information do we know about this variant, and how effective are current vaccines against it? Are we looking with big hope for the year 2022? Let's loop in our panelists from different parts of the world. For more on the latest, joining us in Seoul, Dr. Alice Kim Kyung-tan, internist at the Miss Medi Women's Hospital. In Cambridge, Chris Smith, consultant clinical virologist from the University of Cambridge. Last but not least, in Nanjing, China, Wu Zhiwei, director from the Center for Public Health Research with Medical School of Nanjing University. Today, we are talking about health, particularly Omicron. We see the number is dramatically increasing. How should we interpret this?
Well, this story began at the latter part of last year, of course, when researchers in southern Africa picked up this new variant. And it was presenting in a different way to previous variants of coronavirus, chiefly Delta, in that the symptoms appeared to be different and more trivial. And they were quite surprised when the initial cases turned out to be coronavirus infection. And subsequent analysis shows that this virus is chock full of changes. There are 50 or more genetic changes or mutations in the virus. And the consequence of that is that, one, people who've previously been infected, their previous immunity is less good at protecting against reinfection. But also, people who've been vaccinated are also less well protected. So we're seeing lots of cases, but we're seeing fewer consequences. We're not seeing the same level of translation of those cases into severe disease cases and hospitalizations among the people who catch the infection.
That seems to be the general impressions, that there might be minor, compared to the earlier variants, numbers of hospitalization and also severe cases and deaths. And yet, Dr. Tan, at this moment, can we trust the numbers? As we know, this is the early stage of collecting the numbers.
We don't know if it causes long COVID like the other variants. And it takes time for us to realize and to dissect, differentiate the different effects of previous infections, so natural immunity, and the effectiveness of all the different vaccines that are available throughout every region of the world. So I do agree that in places such as the UK and in South Africa, there's been an explosion of cases, but not a proportional amount of hospitalizations and deaths. But we have to remember that in these two countries, the background incidence of COVID-19, it was actually quite high. We need to be careful when we interpret the results. And I think even though it's been more than a month than it first appeared, we still do need to do our research and stay careful. COVID is a very tricky disease.
You say what you know, and you also tell us what you don't know. On the other hand, Professor Wu, at this time, we also have Omicron and Delta, a combination. So sometimes it's hard to judge whether it is Delta, whether it is Omicron. So what does that mean to the general situation when it comes to medical analysis?
What we know is that the Delta still is dominant in the world, but the Omicron is quickly catching up. The thing is that, like in China, recent small-scale outbreaks, we do sequence analysis to see whether this is Omicron or whether this is Delta. So basically, in situation, in a number of cities, we identify that still dominant strains are the Delta variants, but Omicron did appear in a number of cases. So basically, that means that the virus, the new variant will spread fast. The thing is, as Dr. Ken mentioned, that we still do not have a full comprehensive analysis, but in terms of clinical relevance, whether it's causing more disease or hospitalization, we still have to conduct a very serious, careful scientific analysis.
I see. What do you say about the general situation in terms of treatment, in terms of vaccines, all kinds of vaccines that have been recognized by WHO? How much do we know about them in front of these two variants?
Well, one of the things we do know is that this Omicron variant, because it looks so different to our immune system, and it does seem to be more transmissible, and scientists now, by doing various bits of research on the way the virus works, have worked out that it's not just because it's evading immunity. The biology of the virus has also changed. The way it gains access to cells, and therefore the parts of the body it tends to infect better and spread through better, has changed. So the clinical syndrome is a bit different. But actually, because it looks different, because it's very transmissible, because it grows fast and spreads fast, it quite quickly appears to be displacing Delta as the dominant circulating strain. In other words, where the vast majority of, say, the UK's COVID cases were the Delta agent, within weeks of the arrival of Omicron, that had completely flipped round. And more than 90% of the diagnoses that we're now making in the UK are because of Omicron. And so there was a period of time when both did circulate in the country at roughly equal proportions, but it's now very heavily skewed towards Omicron. Some of the treatments we have do work better with one of those forms than the other, and specifically some of these therapeutic antibodies. There are some which actually it doesn't matter which variant you're infected with, they will continue to work. But there are others that work much less well against Delta. So knowing which it is when you're in that kind of half and half period where one is not the dominant strain yet, yes, that makes a difference. But in our experience, because of fast spread, it displaced Delta very, very quickly. So the vast majority of the cases we're now diagnosing are the Omicron variant.
Yeah. Following on the speed of spreading in terms of Omicron, what could that mean? Would there be a natural process? Do you see that could happen? Do we have any judgment about that possibility?
It's a tantalizing and tempting hypothesis, actually supported by history. Because if one winds the clock back to the late 1800s, there was a big pandemic in about 1890, which everyone at the time ascribed to flu. And until fairly recently, we called it the Russian flu. But subsequent reanalysis suggests that that was actually a coronavirus, and a coronavirus which we still have circulating today in humans called OC43. And we suspect that back in the 1890s, a cow coronavirus called bovine coronavirus jumped into humans and caused that pandemic. But then over time, the virus adapted, we adapted, and we became better bedfellows, to the extent that OC43 for the last 100 years has continued to circulate in people and doesn't cause severe clinical illness anymore. It causes the common cold. So it is tempting to speculate that the ultimate fate for coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, will adopt the same fate ultimately. It has already, we think, become endemic. It's not going to go away. So what's its ultimate fate? Its ultimate fate is to leave in its wake a population of humans very familiar with this virus, who catch it many times across their lifetime, starting with when they're very young, so they have a degree of underlying immune foundation, as it were, so that when they do catch it again when they're old, they're not actually getting severe disease. And on top of that, we have a virus which is much more benign to us, ultimately, and that's one possible direction that Omicron may take.
South Korea, in the early stages, were just like China, try to be a bit different in the approach toward the pandemic, but later it opened up to a certain extent the border until Omicron. What about South Korea?
Right. So yesterday, unfortunately, South Korea reported our first 2 fatalities due to Omicron COVID. They were both in fully vaccinated people. And so that is one face of Omicron COVID. Yes, it can cause asymptomatic disease. Yes, it can cause mild disease, but it can also be fatal. And it can be fatal in people who have had 2 doses of either AstraZeneca or Pfizer. That is the reality. And so we need to accept that reality and prepare. And so our strategy has been to accelerate our deployment of booster vaccinations, because there is good evidence that receiving 3 shots of an mRNA vaccine will offer good protection against even the Omicron variant and, of course, the Delta variant, which is still our dominant strain. I would also like to see increased surveillance, I would say general surveillance. We don't do wastewater surveillance in South Korea, but I think that would be a good idea once we get transmission levels very low. And maybe looking into the future, when we have low transmission levels, COVID under control, if we do wastewater surveillance, we can localize outbreaks earlier and perhaps use a method of containment so that it doesn't spread. Because I think if we learned anything over the last 2 years, it's that the earlier you act, the easier it is to manage this disease. If you wait until it's become widespread, it just extends the duration of the wave that you're in. Of course, we're also authorizing the oral antiviral pills, and we hope that they will improve the situation in terms of decreasing fatalities due to COVID-19. But I think it's time to look towards the future. There was an article recently suggesting the need for developing a universal coronavirus vaccine. I think that's a great idea.
Okay, let me ask also Professor Wu about the situation in China. Now, I do understand there were some breakthrough of Omicron in China from outside China. Yet there has not been, as reported lately, a widespread of Omicron. Mostly of the cases we're dealing with, for example, in Shanxi province, is mainly from Delta variant. So tell us more about how is China, which is quite a COVID naive country, dealing with the potential possibilities, all kinds of possibilities, it seems. Professor Wu.
Well, actually, in China, let's see, the Omicron. Those few cases were identified in a very early stage, and you can see that the government or the local authority stepped in very quickly and identified the close contact and trying to find out the source of the Omicron, whether it's imported or whether it's where they came from, who actually got contact with the first identified cases. So this approach apparently worked very well in terms of break down the transmission link. So far, that those few cases are just the sporadic cases, and it does not develop into a chain of the transmission or community transmission. So that's very good news. But frankly, by identifying cases early step in, it will not prevent the spreading of this virus. Sooner or later, this virus will somehow set foot and start spreading. As the Omicron, as Dr. Smith mentioned, that there are a number of indications that the Omicron may not be as deadly as what we thought, as compared with the Delta variant. Seem to be it's the symptoms are more mild, and also doesn't seem to cause very severe cases hospitalization. I think overall in the virus evolution path, this is there are a number of historical historical precedent. So it's a good news. If the virus goes down in that path, eventually it will become kind of a flu-like virus. We have to probably live with that. If that happens, that we may have to reconsider our current prevention approach to make it more accommodating the new situation.
Now, we know that the WHO chief at the very beginning of the year has been talking about the possibility that we might put COVID-19, at least the outbreak and the huge death related to it, behind us within a year's time. Now, that is a very optimistic, according to some, potential we are describing. How much do you think that will be the case?
I think we will. I think that the vaccines that we have are getting better. They're going to be upgraded to respond to these new variants. The virus is also showing signs that we're getting used to it, it's getting used to us, but the repercussions of this aren't going to be over for a long time yet, because there are many parts of the world where normality won't be restored for a long time hence. There's the short term, when will this be over? Which of course the answer is always as soon as possible. But we're in an incomparably different place, Prime Minister Boris Johnson told everyone at the beginning of the year, now compared to where we were a year ago, but we're still not back to normal. I think we are making big strides towards getting back to normal. In 2022, we will see a greater semblance of normality even than we have now. But we have to also consider the longer term, because there is a huge iceberg now that we've created, which is this hidden cost of COVID. Yes, we've measured the cases. Yes, we've measured the deaths. Yes, we've measured the immediate financial hit. But hidden below the waterline is this enormous burden on people's mental well-being and health, but especially younger people. The cost to younger people in terms of their lost years of education is going to have lifelong consequences. And we absolutely must not forget that. So we must make sure that what we do prioritise in 2022 is restoring the education.
Professor Wu, for you, what do you make of that potential within a year's time?
Well, I think it will be a huge challenge because, if you look at the global situation, it's we're not talking about the industrialized or wealthy countries. Those countries mostly actually are vaccination rates are over 70 or even 80%. But in most of Africa and other, less developed countries, the vaccination rates are appallingly low, some even below 10%. This is a dire situation that we have to deal with, and this is not a very easy task in terms of vaccine distribution. And if you look at the COVAX program, actually, initially we had a huge expectations that the vaccine equal distribution will be changed or will be achieved through this program, but apparently we haven't been able to do that. That's, I think, account for one of the major reasons why the COVID-19 is still circulating in the world.
So in other words, you do not think it would just happen like that within a year's time, things would back to normal, even from the medical terms, because of many who still do not have access to vaccines. Dr. Tan, analysis from you as well before we go.
I think that yes, in 2022, the impact of COVID-19 will be decreased. We will have oral antiviral agents. We will have new vaccines that are better in terms of their effectiveness, easier to deploy. We will have more vaccines. But look at the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, and still they have not been able to get their population fully vaccinated. So it's not just a matter of vaccines. I think it's also a communications problem that we have right now. It's a psychological issue in terms of convincing people that we need to do the right thing. What is the right thing? And how do we do it? And how do we facilitate people to get vaccinated so that we can get over the pandemic? I would love to not talk about the pandemic this time next year. I would love for it to be beyond us. But I'm actually a little bit pessimistic. I think there are just too many challenges ahead of us. But yes, the impact of the disease will be much less in the coming year than it has been over the last 2 years.
I think we should, in a way, make a potential party for the four of us. If things are really getting better, we can put the COVID-19 behind us, or only within small communities. We should cheer on air, right? We should all have a glass of champagne on air and cheer for one another. That could be a deal.